myself and a few other people, we got an ad hoc committee together of Bostonians, and we put tonight's event together. And it's a discussion on ICE and the work that they do in the city of Boston. There is a movement by the political hegemony of this city that wants to remove ICE from our courthouse, where they go to arrest illegal aliens in a gun-free zone. And this is kind of taking sanctuary cities to a new level, sanctuary courts. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to have Mr. Todd Lyons, who is the new acting regional head of ICE. And if you give him a nice round of applause. As I said, Todd is the acting field office director. He previously was the assistant director of law enforcement activities for Oklahoma and North Texas. He, on his resume, he has been a detective of the Tampa Police Department. He's been a member of state law enforcement in Florida. He's a U.S. Air Force veteran. And most importantly, he is a son of South Boston. Let's give him a nice welcome. And our interviewer tonight is Jessica Vaughan. She is the Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a Washington, D.C. based research institute that examines the impact of immigration on American society, educates policymakers, opinion leaders on immigration issues. She's been with the center since 1992. Her area of expertise is in immigration law is everything. And we're lucky to have her in this area. And she's recently completed several major projects, including a Department of Justice funded study on the use of immigration law enforcement in transnational gang suppression, which we know an awful lot about here in Boston with the presence of MS-13 and other gangs. She is an instructor for senior law enforcement, law enforcement officer training seminars at Northwestern University Center for Public Safety in Illinois. Prior to joining the center, Jessica was a foreign service officer with the U.S. State Department, where she served in Belgium and Trinidad and Tobago. Her articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the National Review, the Boston Globe, the Economist, San Francisco Chronicle. She's been frequently cited in the news, and she often appears on National Public Radio, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Fox News. Yeah, Howie Carr. Howie Carr. And she has a master's degree from Georgetown University, and she earned her bachelor's degree in international studies at Washington College in Maryland. And before we get started, we have give her a big round of applause. You know, a lot of people said to me, like, oh, you're going to have another symposium on immigration, and, you know, don't you know that's the political third rail, and you're going to get all kinds of protesters and people that get upset. And the last time we did this 2 years ago, we had 70 protesters, and I think we have about 7 tonight. And a lot of them came inside, which I'm glad they did. You're more than welcome here. But I'd like to remind everyone that of a little historical anecdote. When Frederick Douglass was prevented from speaking in Boston by the mayor, who sent plainclothes police and a whole bunch of other hooligans to break up the speech in June of 1880. And 2 days later, Frederick Douglass was able to come and speak, and he said these words: "It would be no vindication of the right of speech to prove that certain gentlemen of great distinction, eminent for their learning and ability, are allowed to freely express their opinion on all subjects, including the subject of slavery. Such a vindication would need itself to be vindicated. It would add insult to injury. Not even an old-fashioned abolition meeting could vindicate that right in Boston just now. There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up or however humble, however young or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. And that's what we're going to hear tonight, is honest sentiments from two of the leading policymakers on immigration in the Northeast and in the country. And so I hope that you'll just give them your attention. We're going to have a session of question and answers at the end. And if you don't agree with what they have to say, please respect their right to free speech and the listeners' right to hear their free speech. And thank you all for being a great audience. And thanks for coming.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you all for coming. I just wanted to check, can you, I think I hear that my microphone is on now. And welcome to Todd Lyons. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
I have a few topics that I would like to go through with Mr. Lyons, and then definitely want to leave some time for questions from the audience, because I know there will be some. But I do want to go through some things. The first thing that I think is important to hear is an explanation of what enforcement and removal operations and ICE do. Tell us a little bit about what you do, what your men and women do here, how they go about their job, and explain, basically give us a crash course in immigration enforcement, because I think that's fundamental to understanding some of the controversy around ICE.
So one of the main things is that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, came about after 9/11. After the 9/11 Commission came, they saw the need to have a combined Homeland Security entity separate than Department of Justice. ERO is one half of the immigration component for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There's Homeland Security investigations, and then the division that I work for is Enforcement Removal Operations. We primarily focus on those illegal aliens and undocumented individuals, as well as immigrants who have committed crimes in the United States. Those that are locked up in local jails are wanted by local police departments. ERO is also responsible for the custody management and the custody responsibility for all Department of Homeland Security for anyone that's non-citizen. So if someone's arrested by U.S. Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection at the airport or one of the ports of entries, we're responsible for the well-being and housing of anyone that's arrested by a DHS entity.
In New England.
In New England. And we also are tasked with the case management of those cases for individuals that are going through immigration proceedings.
And what does case management mean?
So case management...
Are they all detained, or?
No, so in New England, we have approximately 600 individuals currently that are detained in Massachusetts and New England. The ERO Boston field office has a smaller footprint than a lot of the other ICE field offices throughout the nation, just because we're not a border-centric office. Mm-hmm. You'll see a larger detention population in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. While we do share a good portion of the northern border, the apprehension rate just isn't there. So currently we have about 78,000 individuals throughout New England in a non-detained setting, which means that they're either began their immigration process or they've already been ordered deported or ordered removed from the United States by an immigration judge, and they're either in the appeal phase with the Immigration Appeals Board or the First Circuit, or even up to the Supreme Court. So only 0.1% of the immigration population that are in immigration proceedings in New England are actually detained.
In custody. In
custody. The rest are either released on an order of cognizance on their own pretrial, or an order of supervision after they've been formally ordered removed from the United States, where they're given the opportunity to work on their travel documents and make arrangements to leave the United States on their own in a non-detained setting.
So you've got 78,000 or so cases of people on your docket who are in some stage of proceedings. and 600 of them are detained.
Right,
which, as
approximately
you pointed out,
600 detained right now.
That's a small percentage of the caseload, obviously.
Right, and you know, with the small amount of detention space that we are responsible for in the New England area, it really focuses our enforcement efforts on the actual criminal element and public safety or national security threats that have, you know, affect the New England area.
A lot of the cases, I mean, we do hear about some of the criminal aliens who have been arrested after committing some offense. Sometimes drug traffickers, sometimes drunk drivers, fraud cases, and so on. But we also hear a lot about cases of people, for example, who maybe have applied for asylum and were not successful, and so have been arrested, maybe come on your radar screen after an arrest for something else locally, and then they're considered a priority. Can you describe the caseload of people who are detained? How many of them are people involved in criminal activity, either convicted criminals or pending criminal charges, versus what some people have described as otherwise law-abiding immigrants? Sure.
So when it comes to immigration detention away from the border, you'll see anywhere upwards of 85% to 90% of those detained have some sort of criminal history or pending criminal charges, either at the state, local level, or at the federal level with the Bureau of Prisons.
So 95%?
Yeah, you'll see any range from 85 to 95%. The majority of the cases on border detention are of those who have entered either at a port of entry or across the border illegally. So the lower non-criminal immigration detention mostly you see on the border. In the interior, though, we mostly encounter those who have committed a crime, who have current pending charges, or have been previously deported for an egregious case like an aggravated felony and have returned to the United States.
And returning after deportation is itself a felony?
Yes, so 8 U.S.C. 1326 is re-entry after deportation, which is a felony, which that can run anywhere from 18 months up to 8 years in federal prison, depending on the egregiousness of the crime and the number of times that an individual has been previously deported.
Right, because most of the people who've been deported once were usually targeted for the same reason that your other cases are targets, and that is because of criminal activity.
Right, and most of the time through biometric hits, which everyone knows is someone's fingerprints. That's how we identify a criminal element that's within the criminal justice system that's foreign-born.
Through the secure communities.
Through secure communities, which goes through the FBI fingerprint database. So if there's an immigrant or someone who came as had a U.S. visa from the State Department, a lawful permanent resident, or what's commonly known as a green card holder, or someone that's been arrested before by local law enforcement and has been previously encountered by a DHS entity, those fingerprints are flagged in real time, which gives notification to us in enforcement and removal operations if there's someone in custody that we would be interested in speaking to.
So DHS gets an alert of any non-citizen who's arrested whose fingerprints are in your system. How often does that happen, and does this mean that every person who's arrested who's in your system is likely to be detained? And
no, so each case is looked at individually, and because of the lack of resources in the interior, especially like in the Boston field office, we don't have the amount of officers and agents that they do in larger cities along the border, California, San Diego. We just don't have that larger footprint. So we have to use our resources wisely and focus on the public safety threat and the worst of the worst. Just because someone's born outside the United States, that doesn't mean that there's an immigration action that's going to be taken against them. One that we encounter a lot is someone that's born to a military family who is a United States citizen, but they list their place of birth Germany, London, wherever the base they were born at, that is flagged as, foreign born. So we have to use our resource and due diligence to investigate every case to ensure that the person that we're going to take in immigration enforcing it is that A, is foreign born and doesn't have the authorization to be in the United States, and B, is, a public safety threat and someone that we actually want to either detain or take a closer look at.
Because we do get the impression sometimes, whether from media coverage or from local politicians, that there is this kind of sweeping dragnet of ICE that is made possible through the Secure Communities program, but it sounds like really you're pretty limited based on resources.
We're extremely, resources is a big factor for us, especially, like I said, in interior enforcement. The other factor is when you have those smaller amount of resources, it's what you're going to put towards. And this is my third administration. So each administration has their own take on immigration enforcement. And what I explained before, when under President Obama, when the Priority Enforcement Program came out, if you can imagine a local law enforcement agency, so say Boston Police Department, and you were going to focus all your resources just strictly on traffic enforcement and speed, those people could be going to work, trying to, make a better life for themselves, but they got caught speeding. If you have every law enforcement resource out on, Route 128 doing traffic enforcement, you're going to miss the interior where you have drugs, gangs. So it's finding that balance of what the actual public safety threat and where you need to put your resources. And that's,
because you don't want to let speeders off necessarily.
Right, so they violated the law, but in the meantime, you don't want to just focus on that and not have your efforts elsewhere where you could be better deployed. And that's why we have to go ahead and look at exactly what the public safety threat is. For us, the biggest issue we have, obviously, that's in the news is heroin and fentanyl. We're in gangs. We'd much rather focus our resources on that.
What's the connection there for how is having a robust ICE presence and activity helpful in dealing with the opioid epidemic and gangs?
It's one of the major things we've seen is there's just a large corridor from the border, from the southwest border of narcotics, which are brought up to New England.
Explain how that happens, because we're pretty far from the southern border.
Sure. So most cartels is a pretty integrated network, which a large amount does come through the ports of entry that are smuggled in through, shipping lanes, trucking. But there's also an element that's brought across by foot or vehicle or boat through the southern border. I just came from Texas where it's staged in Laredo, but yet you would see large hubs of drugs that would be moved up through Dallas, up through Oklahoma, and then sent up through northern states, primarily like Iowa, Kansas. From there, drugs would be broken down and shipped either north to Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And we also see a lot that comes across the water too as well. We see a lot that comes up from Puerto Rico. We see a lot that comes up from Dominican Republic. And with Boston having large shipping ports as well as fishing areas where boats can bring in large amount, we also have that element as well.
So who is doing, do the cartels have operatives here operating locally in New England or in different New England communities, or are they working with other gangs, or how does that?
We've seen both, and actually National Geographic does a better job than I do, which is 2016, their series Drugs Inc. did a whole series on opioids in Boston. And if you go to minute 43 in their document for that series, they specifically say that the largest amount of heroin distribution is by people from Dominican Republic that are illegally present in the United States and based out of Lawrence, Massachusetts. So that isn't even from a government standpoint, that's from a TV series.
National Geographic.
So the presence is definitely real in Massachusetts.
And that's been corroborated by other reports that I've seen, whether it's hospitals looking, talking to people about where they obtain their drugs, or other law enforcement agencies saying that there definitely are hubs of activity here in the greater Boston area.
Right, and it was one of the main reasons that New Hampshire saw the spike in overdoses that they did, along with southern Maine, was the corridor on 495, which ran up through the southern part of New Hampshire in Maine, was just a large amount of fentanyl and heroin that was coming from the Lawrence Lowell area.
Are these traffickers recruiting people to work for them here locally, or are they arriving with the specific purpose of trafficking here?
I would say it's a mixture of both.
So ICE can play a role. I mean, it seems to me, and what I have found in research, is that when a criminal is also in the country illegally, that makes them more vulnerable to law enforcement as a result. I mean, we have plenty of obviously crime is not a job Americans won't do, we all know that. But we're stuck with the American citizens who commit crimes.
Right. And that's one of the hard things for us, is that we have the opportunity to take an actual criminal element out of the community, out of the public. So when our hands are tied, when we don't have that cooperation, it's frustrating for us, because we don't understand why, if you have that chance to remove that piece of the criminal element out of the equation, you wouldn't let us have the opportunity to do our job.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's back up a little bit, because when the system is working the way it's supposed to, when the Secure Communities program is working the way Congress and the government agencies who are involved set it up, the idea was that a non-citizen is arrested, fingerprinted, identified, vetted through the Law Enforcement Support Center up in Williston, Vermont, where analysts review the cases and then send them back down to the field office.
Right.
To you, where your officers make a decision about whether or not to pursue this case based on your resources and other things you know about the case. And then you would, and this happens very quickly, then let's say you have a case, someone who's been arrested for heroin trafficking, and you want to move on them. They're sitting in the Lawrence jail, or in, what's Lawrence, Middlesex County?
Essex County.
Essex County. And there they are. What happens next? How do you let local law, the way it's supposed to work, what would happen?
So historically, ICE would reach out to that law enforcement entity. We would coordinate with the police department, sheriff's department, state police, to come question that individual to see if that was someone that ICE was interested in. We would then issue what's known as immigration detainer, which gives the local law enforcement the ability to detain someone for us up to 48 hours. In Massachusetts, before last year, that was the normal everyday practice.
With most law enforcement agencies in the Commonwealth were
Yes, and nationwide.
complying.
Yeah, they would comply with holding that individual till we went and either picked them up, or we made a determination if we were going to take them into custody or not.
So this is like someone who's wanted by another state or by another federal agency or something. The local jail would say, okay, yeah, we'll hold them for you.
Sure, and what it would be is, say someone gets arrested, and one of the most common ones we hear a lot as well, someone may just get arrested for driving with no license.
Which is a crime.
Correct, but a lot of local agencies don't see the larger criminal history someone may have. Us and the FBI have access to. So we might.
So that's not going to show up on their.
A lot of times, a lot of state prosecutors only see the criminal history for their state. So someone could have committed homicide in California and been a fugitive from ICE from there, or have done something say in Florida, they were arrested for drug trafficking, served time, and then left, and have now taken on the identity of someone else. And they were arrested in, Brighton. And when they were taken into Suffolk County, they were fingerprinted, and their true identity was shown. While that person was only arrested for driving with no license, they had an underlying criminal history, which brought them to ICE's attention.
But the locals wouldn't necessarily know about that unless they're communicating with you.
Correct.
So what has changed? You said that that's the way it was
Sure.
over a year ago. What's changed here?
The Massachusetts Supreme Court had the Lund decision, which pretty much makes it null and void, if not illegal, for a state, local, police department, sheriff's department, house correction to hold someone for ICE within the Commonwealth.
So basically telling every law enforcement agency in the Commonwealth that they may not.
They cannot hold someone for a civil immigration violation, which in effect hampers us because, like I said, as far as resources, if we can't get to a location quick enough by the time someone's, let's say, released on their own recognizance or they bond out, we may never see that individual again. And they also may not get the information that we have that individual may not be the person who they think it is in their custody.
What was the rationale of the Supreme Judicial Court in that?
So one kind of...
and tell us a little bit about the case that...
Sure. So one kind of misnomer about ICE is people stay in immigration detention indefinitely. There was a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court called Zavidas, which if Immigration and Customs Enforcement can't remove someone after a certain period of time and their country won't take them back, after 90 days, if they can't produce a travel document, the case goes to our headquarters and then it's adjudicated from there. After then, we can't hold anyone in custody longer than 6 months. It's against the law for us to hold someone in permanent detention like that. In the Lund case, it was an individual from Cambodia who was an aggravated felon and filed a habeas with the state court that we will hold him in custody. The Massachusetts Supreme Court then came back that it was unlawful for a local agency to hold someone on a civil immigration detainer for any period of time.
Even though Congress has given ICE the authority to issue these detainers.
Right, and the detainers were a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was enacted back in the 50s. So this has been on the books ever since 1950. So subsequently, local agencies can't hold individuals like this. And right after the Lund decision was enacted, this individual was released. We actually did have a travel document for him. He was scheduled for removal. He was released, and within a month's time frame, had went out and robbed and assaulted an elderly woman in a wheelchair in an ATM machine. So he's currently back in custody right now in Suffolk County. So we hope to take custody of him once he finishes his stay time.
I mean, that's inevitably the result of these policies, is that if you can't take them, they're going to be released.
Oh, correct, yeah. I mean, and, immigration law falls under the Constitution as well. We can't hold someone unlawfully for any indefinite amount of time. So even someone that's foreign-born or non-immigrant, they're afforded their rights just like anyone else under the Constitution. It's just harder when we do have the opportunity, like I said earlier, to remove a criminal element from the public, and our hands get tied.
From what I've seen, looking at criminal justice statistics nationally, is that non-citizens who commit crimes reoffend at the same rates as American criminals do, which can be as much as half the time within a short period of time. So when these criminals are released, they have the opportunity, they're sent back to the community and have the opportunity to reoffend and create new victims. When, if they had been held in custody for you, as Congress has given the authority to happen and created a system for that to happen, they could have been sent home instead of back to the streets.
Right, and that's when we were talking about immigration detention earlier. We would like to focus on those that are an actual true threat to the community. Part of that large amount of the non-detained population we have are those that have been arrested, but they do have strong ties to the communities, that do have pending benefits. They might be a lawful permanent resident green card holder, and they're going through their regular local court proceedings just like they would at the same time they're going through the immigration proceedings. So the misconception that we are holding up the justice system by removing someone so they don't have their day in court is also a false narrative, because these individuals that have been arrested by us, which we have released on some type of monitoring or in a non-detained setting, are still going through. They're getting their time in front of the court to either plead their case, and a lot of times they get dismissed, and a lot of times those cases do end up working out for the good of a foreign-born person, which they do eventually come on, become a lawful permanent resident or a citizen. The problem is that decisions like Lund, certain policies which hinder cooperation with ICE, also runs the risk of having that extreme violent felon be released back.
Yeah, and we're starting to hear about these cases more and more often of people who've been released because locals won't cooperate. Now, local law enforcement agencies can't hold them for ICE, but what can they do?
When a local law enforcement agency does receive those fingerprint hits, they have the ability to reach out to us and notify us that they do have that individual in custody. Unfortunately, it's something we've seen nationwide. Here in the Commonwealth, we've seen a lot of agencies that have adopted a sanctuary policy where they won't actively cooperate with ICE. They won't hinder our law enforcement abilities, but they won't take any extra steps to notify us if someone's in custody.
So they're missing an opportunity to have somebody removed from the community instead of sent back to the street.
Instead of sent back, yeah.
What other kinds of things in reading the papers, listening to the radio, you hear occasionally some cases where individual judges, for example, are deciding that they don't want ICE in their courthouses. Well, actually, I should back up a little bit. Why is ICE in courthouses more often now than before?
So ICE isn't, we would rather arrest someone in a secure environment. When someone's identified in a jail, when they're in booking or they're in a house of corrections, that's a secure environment. We would much rather have our officers and agents go inside and interview those individuals and take custody of them in a secure environment.
Well, I know where I'd rather arrest a gang member.
It's safer for the officers.
In the jail.
And it's safer for the community as well. I would be a fool to sit up here and say that we don't have, the presence of ICE in a neighborhood doesn't have some type of chilling effect. The word that's like nails on chalkboard for me is a raid. ICE is doing a raid. We would much rather not have our officers out in a neighborhood that's, unsafe. We'd much have it in a controlled environment. This person has already been arrested for something, or they've already been arrested for something else. There is a reason that they came to the attention of ICE. We didn't go seek them out. They did something that's illegal or criminal outside of their immigration status. So the immigration status is a second part of the arrest. When they're released back on the street, now my officers have to go out and find that individual. It's just like a local police officer makes a traffic stop. The passenger in the car may be the target that they're looking for, but they might ID everyone else in the car, and someone may have a warrant for their arrest. Local law enforcement isn't going to leave that person behind. It's the same with us.
Surprise, surprise, criminals hang around together. So.
And there might be a wanted criminal with a van load of day laborers who are just trying to work. Well, now those poor individuals have now come on the radar of ICE. That's why ICE would much rather do targeted enforcement on individual people.
Who are sitting in a jail.
They're already in a jail. in a secure environment, and again, that they're there for, they did an action that put them in jail. So, like I said, ICE is a secondary step in the arrest process. When someone does appear in court, or they're transferred from court, from the jail to court for either first appearance or their bail hearing, they're still inside a secure environment. We would much rather arrest them there before they get a chance to go back on the street.
How do you know when someone has a court date? Is that public information? Is that why?
Most of the time, we're notified either by the House of Corrections or local law enforcement, when subjects next time going to be in court.
In the places that agree to cooperate?
Yes.
Because do all of them do that?
Not all. And a lot of it is just a lot of investigative work by the officers and agents to track down and look at court dockets and see exactly when someone's going to be in jail. Be in court that day.
So when ICE is going out into communities, they're more visible. It's obviously more dangerous for ICE agents, but also they become more, that can be intimidating to people who live in that community. But is it fair to say that the sanctuary policies are what is causing ICE to be doing the very kind of enforcement that proponents of sanctuary policies say that they don't like, which is the public?
Well, it's that public perception, and it's the public that we're forcing more and more people into the shadows. That crime is going to spike because people aren't going to come forward or testify or report crimes. Again, like I said earlier, this is my third administration. The previous, under President Obama, the 8 years I did immigration enforcement in Texas, in Oklahoma, we never saw it as bad as this. The worst part is when you politicize law enforcement, it makes it hard for everyone. So to hear that, ICE agents are the reason why crime's going to go up because they're in a community, or victims aren't safe because ICE there, it's fundamentally false. The other thing we hear a lot too, and you and I have discussed before in the past, that ICE is arresting people that are going to testify, that's a witness. ICE is arresting people at the courthouse that are getting their marriage license. I would love, I've said it before on every forum that I've done, both pro-ICE and anti-ICE. Just give me the example of the person we arrested that was a witness. Just one. I can tell you flat out, we do not arrest victims. We don't arrest witnesses. We are there specifically for the individual who committed a crime that put them in that courtroom.
Yeah, because I do hear sometimes, whether in debates or in talking to the news media or others, there are folks who support sanctuary policies who will say that, yes, of course, we think that criminals should be removed from the country, but ICE can get them other ways. It's too, if local law enforcement agencies are cooperating with ICE, if people think that if they go in to report a crime, that the police officers are going to call ICE, that they're not going to do it. This so-called chilling effect is a bigger problem that has to be avoided. And if ICE has to work harder to go find people, so be it. The problem with that I found is looking at both the statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from academic studies that have been done. Even I myself did an analysis of Boston's calls for service before and after secure communities was implemented. And I don't see that there's any such chilling effect. There's no evidence that immigrants or anyone else start refraining from reporting crimes because of greater cooperation with ICE. It just seems to be a complete myth.
Yeah, to me, it is a myth. And, I haven't done the in-depth research like you have, but we have had victims of domestic violence through their attorneys or the victim advocacy program reach out to us and say, hey, we thought you guys deported this individual. We thought, he wasn't going to be released back. And now a lot of the times as we hear from some of the victim advocate groups that a lot of people victims of domestic violence don't want to report it because why are they going to report it when someone's just released and they thought ICE was going to hold them, and they go back and they victimize the person all over again?
So they're afraid of reporting not because of themselves, having contact with ICE, but because the criminal is going to be released. So
the system has failed them. So where they thought that this, the victim would be safe because the criminal element was taken out, they just released right away before we had the opportunity to take action.
So they're afraid of the criminals who are released by the sanctuary policies.
Right, and
not of ICE.
And the other part too is a lot of these same criminals victimize the non-U.S. citizen because they know that they'll go back to their community, and because of the bad information, the chilling effect like we talk about, that they can go ahead and they can continue to commit crimes because it's a more vulnerable population that these people don't want to come forward. So not only is it an impact on, communities like West Roxbury, Boston, but communities like, Lawrence and Lowell that do have a large foreign-born population, when you have repeat offenders go back there because they know that the good, hardworking people of those areas aren't going to report crime because they're afraid of us, and it's just been a myth that's been put out there.
So proposals like the so-called Safe Communities Act and the Trust Act and so on actually work counter to these goals of building trust between local law enforcement agencies and ICE and the local community. They work against trust.
And actually, so prior to the current administration, under the Priority Enforcement Program, there was a list of specific crimes, specific reasons why, Immigration and Customs Enforcement took action on someone. And we didn't have a lot of the issues that we do now. It wasn't as politicized. It wasn't as much sanctuary policies. Again, coming from Dallas and speaking from my experience, Sheriff Lupe Valdez, which was the sheriff of Dallas County, she was the Democratic opponent for the current Texas governor now, ran against Greg Abbott. She was in law enforcement. She was a previously retired customs agent. And she was very progressive leaning, but even she saw the need to have her list of own crimes where she told her deputies and staff that, yes, these people need to be taken out of our community. And one of the biggest things she focused on was these were repeat offenders that were going back into the immigrant community. So for us, that was a positive that we had someone who was more of a progressive sanctuary style, but still saw the need to identify the criminal element that ICE could take action.
Yeah, if the issue is access to police services, if the concern is that you want immigrants to feel comfortable reporting crimes and to not be afraid to, there are many other ways to get that do not involve stifling immigration enforcement. You can have anonymous tip lines, you can have language designated officers, you can have community forums, you can have, Massachusetts is full of award-winning community policing programs. Need to shut off immigration enforcement to achieve that kind of relationship with immigrant communities, it seems to me.
Right.
Have you noticed a public safety impact of the sanctuary policies that is,
We've seen it just in the fact that, just for example, the heroin and opioid epidemic. And that's one of the repeat thing we constantly hit upon because that is really a challenge, a law enforcement challenge to the state right now. If you see any public debate, any talk at the State House or at the state and local level with police chiefs and law enforcement companions, they're all focusing on that. What can we do to curb the opioid crisis? We recently did a joint Department of Justice operation, which again focused on strictly up in Essex County. And we absolutely don't want to pick on the city of Lawrence all the time, but that's just the main hub for fentanyl and heroin. And, you know, we, as a group with Department of Justice, us, DEA, FBI, ATF, focused on, again, a strictly targeted operation on fentanyl and heroin traffickers. Because local law enforcement, like Lawrence Police Department, just don't have the resources to handle that. We arrested 58 criminals during that one-day operation. Out of that 58, 49 were foreign-born or previously deported, and they seized enough fentanyl to kill half the state of Massachusetts. You would think, you know, operations like that would be evident enough to show that at least let us assist and help on those efforts. You know, you'd think operations like that would show our worth to what we can do to public safety.
Well, another area of law enforcement and public safety that has, I've noticed, become somewhat more politicized lately has been gang disruption and anti-gang efforts. And sometimes there is a nexus with immigration enforcement as well, particularly when you're talking about those particular gangs that have a lot of non-citizens who are members, like MS-13, 18th Street, and so on. And you know, there was a time about 10 years ago when ICE was working very closely, even with some of the jurisdictions that are now considered sanctuaries, to address this problem. Now, and they made a big dent in MS-13 activity and other gangs here in the areas, particularly around Boston. But we've seen a resurgence of some of these gangs lately, in part because of the influx of unaccompanied minors from Central America. For example, I've seen other ICE agents say that something like 30 to 40% of the MS-13 members who've been arrested by ICE originally arrived in the country as unaccompanied minors. And
right, and that was actually at the influx of the unaccompanied minors in 2013, 2014. So what we saw was a large amount of, you know, unaccompanied young kids, 10, 12, 13, who came in and they were literally had a address pinned to them and ran to the first Border Patrol agent they saw. It was like return to sender. And they had a family member in the United States. It was just such a large influx at the southern border that, you know, we couldn't get any, you know, couldn't reach family members, you know, at the whatever, you know, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, wherever they were from, to come, you know, pick up these children, that they were released to family members or individuals in the U.S. who would take them in. But what we see, though, is like anything, you have young kids that come in to areas that already have a criminal element that's already rooted, and now they're joining the gangs to fit in with the kids who have been here before, or just a criminal element that's here before. So now we've seen the uptick in kids that have come in the first wave of the unaccompanied minors back, you know, like I said, 2012 to 14, which are now high school age, that are, you know, committing crimes. And, you know, and again, we still see more of an influx now that are coming in that are just a new wave that's going to get ready.
yeah, it hasn't stopped. It hasn't slowed down much. What do you think that can be done to address that problem in particular?
You know, for us, when we can work with local law enforcement to root out the main issue that's leading kids to gang violence, or that criminal element that's recruiting. A lot of the times in a lot of the gangs you'll see, especially in MS-13, is you'll have older individuals who have been established here in the United States that are, you know, going after those vulnerable, you know, kids that are here in their own, that are in the immigrant community, that are recruiting them and bringing them into that lifestyle when they think that there's no other choice that they have. The problem is that when you have the repeat gang members, the serious violent ones that have already been identified by local law enforcement, which aren't turned over to ICE, which, you know, ICE isn't afforded the opportunity to remove them from the element. That just it keeps that, keeps that individual there to just keep recruiting and building more and more, which is going to lead to more kids who did come for a better life turn into gang violence.
The ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Boston Police Department to obtain access and make public the database of gang members that is maintained. What effect would that have on your ability to cooperate with Boston Police Department? Or to address the problem?
Sure. I mean, I can't speak specifically to like any type of ongoing litigation. So it's just in generality, any time that information is stifled to us, it hurts our ability to do our mission. Again, law enforcement, whether it's Boston Police, DEA, FBI, us, it shouldn't be politicized. It's the letter of the law. There should be nothing misconstrued about law enforcement officers doing their job, operating under the guidance of, written law that's been on the books for an extremely long time, that are all working in a common effort just to protect citizens. Anytime that information is stifled or the use of it may be interpreted one way which isn't favorable, that has extreme impact on public safety.
Well, I just have one more question that I'd like to ask you before we turn to the audience, because I know there'll be some questions from the audience, and that is, I know it's not all sanctuaries around the Commonwealth, that there are some law enforcement agencies here that are working particularly with ICE. I wonder if you could just take a minute to explain the 287G program that has been, that a number of sheriffs in the state have been enrolled in. In fact, Mass Department of Corrections has had for more than 10 years, I think.
The Massachusetts Department of Corrections is one of the longest standing 287G partnerships within our agency.
Started under Governor Romney, I think.
Right. And it's been a great partnership. It identifies criminal aliens that are getting ready to be released after long-term prison sentence in the state of Massachusetts. It also helps to identify inmates that have adopted U.S. citizen identities that have been living under false identities for the longest time. So the 287G partnership, 287G is a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which deputizes local law enforcement to act as designated immigration officers. There used to be two models. There was a task force model, which focused on a lot of state police departments, which did a lot of highway interdiction, and the jail model, which primarily focuses on people that have been arrested, like the ones we were talking about earlier. The task force model went away. It was one of the ones that a couple of years ago we saw that did have the most chilling effect as far as, the guys out there doing traffic enforcement were now doing immigration work.
Although here, Massachusetts had a task force also,
Yep.
the staties. I think they were using it for fugitives and
Fugitive smuggling.
drugs,
A lot of human trafficking.
human trafficking. Yeah.
So the jail model focuses on identifying those inmates at the classification level in the first booking that are foreign born. One of our newest partnerships is in Barnstable County. I just recently spoke at their 287G Steering Committee Public Forum, where the sheriff and myself, pretty much it's just an open forum for the community to come and ask about the program, any concerns they have. One of the things I was proud about is, so the partnership is only 8 months old, 9 months old. We started June. During that time frame, they identified 56 individuals that were foreign born that were booked into the Barnstable County Jail on some type of crime. Out of those 56 that were identified, only 12 were identified to ICE for immigration enforcement. Those 12 crimes were 3 for homicide, 4 for rape, and the other ones were all crimes of violence. Out of those 12, 10 are still in custody in Barnstable County serving their time. 2 have been gone through the immigration proceedings. One was formerly deported, and the other one left on a voluntary return to their country. So it was good to show the people in the Cape that, again, someone that's arrested for driving without a license, while you may come to ICE's attention, and you may receive a letter in the mail from us later on that we need to talk to you about your immigration proceedings, you're not going to be locked up at that time. This shows that
It's not like a trap door
no,
to
and it shows that
instant deportation.
all the cases were extremely vetted. So, and the egregiousness of the crime was one thing that I really was happy to highlight, because again, the misnomer is that we're arresting these people, just the 287G officers that are deputized down there are just looking at every individual that comes in, putting people in immigration proceedings, a mass deportation machine, where it's not. 287G is a force multiplier for us. We don't have the resources in the Cape. Cape and the Islands is someplace that's very hard for us to reach.
Yeah.
And to have the ability to identify people that were murders. They identified a wanted Brazilian national that was wanted for murder back in Brazil. Several out of the 12 all had fake Puerto Rican identities that they stole from U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico that were identified through the program. So it's definitely a good partnership, which again identifies the criminal element in a secure environment where ICE officers aren't in the street, aren't in the community, and they're focusing on the worst of the worst.
But that's a big deal for Barnstable County, because several years ago, I remember Sheriff Cummings, the sheriff of Barnstable County, was very frustrated because he had a number of non-citizens that had been identified in county jail that had committed fairly serious crimes that he could not get ICE's attention on to come down and take into custody. And so now with 287G, he has the ability, his officers can start the
Right.
First of all, identify them because they have access to the database that ICE uses, and also launch the proceedings under your supervision, right?
Right, yeah, and the whole 287G program is supervised by ICE deportation officers and supervisors that are on site to screen all the cases as well that those deputies identify.
Mm-hmm. So those 12 cases, you said 12 out of 56
12 out of 56.
were processed for deportation.
They were processed for deportation. The two that were released on bond and later arrested by ICE. Even though Sheriff Cummings does have the program, he still is held to the letter of the law with the Lund decision. Mm-hmm. So ICE wasn't available to take custody of those individuals. So once they were convicted of their crimes, ICE did arrest them, and then they were placed into deportation proceedings. And then the other ones are still either held no bond or high bond, going through their regular criminal cases within Barnstable County.
But these are cases that would never probably have been processed before.
Before, no.
So that's good. All right, is there anything else we should cover before we take some questions from the audience?
No, I think it's just, I thank Lou and I thank you for taking the time for at least, letting me explain what we do. The men and women of ICE they're really true law enforcement professionals, and I think a lot of it gets lost nowadays in the fast-paced news cycle. One thing I like to stress is there's a lot of, misnomers like we talked about in myths. I can only speak to ICE Boston. I can tell you that ICE Boston is not housing any families. We don't have any children in custody. And I speak to the protesters at my office.
Well, there would never be a child in ICE detention.
No, it's
anyway.
The Office of Refugee Resettlement handles all that through a lot of charity work. Catholic Charities is an excellent partner that assists with that, and just you see a lot of the issues on the border bleed over to the north. Mm-hmm. And the positive work we do and the positive impact we have in the community kind of gets lost in that. So I would much rather someone hear it from me, directly from me, whether it be in a pro-immigration setting or in any immigration setting. I'd rather explain our position. If we have a different view, so be it. That's why we live in the United States, right? But I would much rather speak up for the folks that work for me because they do great work every day. And it kind of gets lost in the mix.
Well, thank you very much for all you do and for all the men and women of ICE do for us. And I'd love to take some questions. We have cards, is that?